Here in Chapter 2, we're going to take a look at where to start. One of the hardest problems that people have is how do you actually start doing research? There's a lot of research out there, and if you don't come at it from an organized perspective, you're going to have a really difficult time putting it all together and organizing. So let's take a look at some of the objectives that we have for this chapter, and we'll dive right into how we start doing research. We want to know how to discuss research, we're going to discuss, but we want to know how to compose research questions, hypotheses, and predictions, and how they're related. We want to know about the different sources of ideas for research, including common sense, observation, theories, past research, and practical problems. We're going to talk about two functions of a theory because our research really needs to be theory-based. If you just try to go after doing some kind of research without a real good parameter that's based on theory, you're going to be shooting in the dark because you're not really sure what your goal is or how you're framing your research. We're going to talk about three kinds of research reports. We're going to talk about the sections of an empirical article, something that you've probably recognized before doing some research in a prior class, including the abstract, introduction, method, results, and discussion sections. And to talk about how we can explore past research using databases in Google Scholar. So let's go ahead and jump right into research questions, hypotheses, and predictions, which will be very helpful also for statistics if you're in that class also. So we start with something that's relatively broad called a research question. The research question is what we ask in order to conduct our research. So it's the question that we have about our observations that we are going to study. So it's an actual question. And there are lots of examples of research questions. It could be something like, is there a difference in how freshmen from rural schools compared with urban schools adapt to coming to Olivet College? It could be something like, is there a difference in how people perceive time when they're busy versus when they are bored? Okay, lots of different research questions out there. Generally, the research question is just general and broad, but it does point to the particular way that you're setting up your research through the hypotheses. The hypotheses, I say hypotheses because there is a null and alternative hypothesis, but the null and alternative statements are trying to answer the research question. So, is there a difference between how students from rural communities adapt to college compared to those who come from urban communities? So a hypothesis might be something like there is a significant difference between those two groups and how they adapt to college, and the null hypothesis would be that there is not a significant difference between those two groups. The alternative hypothesis is what you expect to be the difference, not necessarily what the group is going to be different or who's going to adapt better in this particular example, but just that there will be a difference. The null hypothesis is stating that there won't be a difference. And without a real context and statistics for that, it doesn't make a lot of sense at the moment, but this is a good primer for getting set up for determining what the null and alternative hypotheses are. So when we talk about doing the hypothesis and research methods, we're really talking about a specific hypothesis for the test that we're doing that'll get more tied into statistics class. But it is important now that you have a general understanding of what a null and alternative hypothesis is, knowing that we'll elaborate it more in statistics. The prediction is the specific outcome of the hypothesis. So if you have a hypothesis that states that there will be a significant difference between students that come from urban settings compared to those who come from rural settings and how they adapt to Olivet College, the prediction is what we expect to be the outcome. For example, a prediction might be that students from a rural community will adapt better to Olivet College compared with those who came from an urban setting. It follows the hypothesis because we're trying to test those two differences, but it's speculating what the change might be. It has to be testable, so we need to be able to test it, so we need to be able to measure adaptation to Olivet College somehow, and there are lots of scales out there that you can do that. And we can obviously determine if someone comes from a rural or an urban setting prior to coming to Olivet College. So it is testable, and we will use a specific variable and a specific methodology. So the variables might be, what school did you come from? which is a variable because it has two values. In this case, we're just measuring urban and rural. And then another variable would be adaptation. We would measure that somehow, and there are lots of scales that we could find to measure adaptation. And the methodology might be what we call a non-experimental design. We're kind of getting ahead of ourselves, but we recognize that there are specific characteristics of the two groups that we're going to compare together, and that happens to be a non-experimental design, non-equivalent groups. We'll learn more about that later on in the course. But just for now, we're talking about the difference between the research question, hypothesis, and the prediction. This is a good breakdown. Again, this is something from your book, so you have access to this. And if you don't have access to your book for whatever reason at this point, you can clip this image and you can keep it. So this is just a graphical representation of the flow from the research question to the prediction with some definitions and some examples. We don't need to go through this right now. You can take a look at this, and I think that you can make some sense of it. If you have questions, certainly feel free to reach out. So kind of elaborating a little bit on the research question, it's that general concern, and it's a testable statement about an observation. So is there a difference in who goes to the KC for meals? A perfectly fine research question. You might have a question about that. You're looking around the KC and you're like, I wonder who comes here and who doesn't come here for a particular meal. Another research question could be, how long will it take someone to graduate based on their socioeconomic status, whether or not they are an athlete, and GPA? So we could take a look at those three factors: socioeconomic status, their status as an athlete, and their GPA, and we could determine if people are likely to graduate in a certain period of time based on what their answers are to those other questions. So those are general research questions. Now, the hypotheses start to talk about the differences between the groups. So for example, if we had a null and alternative hypothesis, we could have the alternative hypothesis for the research question: is there a difference between lower and upperclassmen, for example, in their use of the KC? The alternative hypothesis is that yes, there is some kind of difference between the lower and upperclassmen. The null hypothesis would be that no, there is not a significant difference. And then going further, we have a prediction. A prediction is that specific outcome based on the hypotheses that we are predicting might happen. And there are lots of theories as to why upperclassmen or lowerclassmen would use the KC more, but maybe we're just going to have the prediction that lowerclassmen will eat more meals per week at the KCs than upperclassmen. So if our research question is there a difference between the use of KC, the null and alternative hypotheses would be, the alternative hypothesis is that there is a significant difference between who uses a KC, upperclassmen versus lowerclassmen, and the null hypothesis would be that there is not a significant difference between those two groups. The particular prediction then would be lowerclassmen will eat more meals per week at the KCs than upperclassmen. Maybe they still like the food, maybe they haven't gotten sick of it, maybe they aren't off campus as much because maybe they're not in a sorority or fraternity or living in an off-campus housing or something like that. Whatever it is, there's lots of theories as to why that's the case, but our prediction is what we think will happen based on our hypotheses. So now that we have a kind of an understanding of the research questions, hypotheses, and predictions, we can kind of start to see how we can use those to leverage our sources of ideas. So we make observations about the world all the time, and those are usually where we start with our sources of ideas. We don't usually say, oh, I'm going to come up with an idea for research, so I'm just going to look through a journal. Generally not. Generally, we look through our curiosity bank. We look to see about the questions we have about the world. So one of the sources of ideas is through common sense. Something like, is a straight line always the closest path between 2 points? That may or may not be. If you've ever looked at Google Maps, for example, you recognize that sometimes the shortest route is not the fastest route. It might be the closest between 2 points, but we're talking about saving some time. So we want to be able to get there the fastest way, and it might not always be the straightest line to get there. The common sense source of ideas usually confronts what we perceive to be usual or given events. It's important that we don't just look at an observation that we have and take it for truth. We need to be able to test it. It's a good source of an idea, but we must test it first. Something that I'm really bad at is finding the shortest line to check out at the grocery line. And I usually make the wrong choice. I don't know what it is about me. It's just really bad luck maybe. But I could pick the shortest line. Somebody in front of me has one item. I get behind them, ready to rock and roll, and all of a sudden there's a problem. Something doesn't scan right. Maybe the coupon isn't getting taken or something. And it takes me longer, and the people in the line next to me are moving much faster. So in that case, a shorter line might not always be the quickest line. So there are a lot of other factors that go into that. And doing a little bit of research, maybe there are other factors besides line length. Maybe I look at the person in front of me and see that they have a whole fistful of coupons all wadded up, and I know that it's going to take a while to process those. So there are some other theories that might go into how quickly I can check out, as opposed to just focusing on the line length. There are also some practical issues, and again, these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, so there can be some overlap between common sense and practical problems, because checking out at the grocery store is a practical problem, but it is also something that's based on common sense, using kind of these rules that we live by, these sayings that we live by. So some issues that impact daily life are things like parking, class schedules, social injustices. Okay, there's a lot of different practical problems that we run into in life. Usually these are these things that get in the way of our goals that we get frustrated by. So when you find yourself getting frustrated by something, it's probably because there's a practical problem in your life that you would like to have a solution to. Sometimes solutions are easy, sometimes they're not easy. So that's why we do some research. Think of things like parking, your class schedule, social injustices. So a good practical problem is, are freshmen at fault for the parking problems on campus? Good question. Maybe freshmen shouldn't be allowed to park on campus, and that would solve the problems that other people have. You know, people who've been here longer ought to be able to park closer. Maybe that's something that's more common sense than anything, but maybe it's not common sense. Maybe it has nothing to do with how long you've been here. But the practical problem can be a source of an idea for solving a parking issue. Now, we know that there is organized parking on campus, but maybe the problem is not that we have organized parking, but that people don't abide by it. So again, we have a practical problem that could be researched from many different perspectives. So the source of the idea leads to any number of perspectives that we could use to design a research project. And we'll talk about the different designs later on in the course, but right now we're talking about where we get these ideas from, and you can look for ideas everywhere. So when you're thinking about the topic for your project, think about the problems that you have. Think about the issues that come up in life that you want to solve, or at least research to find if there is a solution to it. Sometimes all of these sources of ideas are relegated to observations around the world. So it's kind of just this reduction to keeping your eyes open. So here's a good observation. How do people stay up so late and still pass a class? Man, I don't know. I was never a night owl like that. I couldn't imagine staying up so late and then coming to class and doing good work. What about, is working to pay off student debt as a student worth it? So imagine that you're a student right now, which isn't hard, right? But you're also paying off your student loans at the same time. Maybe you don't want to put them on deferment. Maybe they're small enough loans to where you can try to pay them off. Maybe you just don't want the debt at the end of it. Is working right now to pay off student debt worth it? Maybe you're losing out on the college experience. Maybe your grades are suffering. So you make an observation. You do some research. So is it worth it? Okay. What about, why are some professors awesome? I mean, I know why I'm awesome, but I don't know why other professors are so awesome. Well, you could research that and do a qualitative study and see what kind of qualities they have as an instructor that make them awesome. Is a degree from little old Olivet College as meritorious as other colleges? That's a good question. You could survey that. You could find out how people are doing after Olivet College with the degree that they have. You'd be very surprised maybe to see that we have a lot of people at Olivet College who are out in the world doing really big things coming from this little school that has about 1,000 students in it at any given time. We have students that go off to big colleges for grad school. We have students that go off and get big jobs after Olivet College, so you'd be surprised. So we want to look at the observation and wonder, can we produce high-quality students? And the answer is yes, we can. So something else that you can look at is some kind of correlation, or two things that seem to happen together. But is there something there? So here's an interesting thing. When the weather is bad, you'd be surprised at how many people miss class or are late to class. We get 4 or 5 inches of snow, which is kind of, a moderate amount of snow here in Michigan. Most professors will still come to class as long as the roads have been plowed and things like that. But you'd be surprised at how many people who live over at Shippard don't make it to class because of the snow. citing some kind of unreasonable excuse for not coming to class, like maybe the sidewalks hadn't been plowed exactly right, or there might be a little bit of ice out there, forgetting about the fact that if it were something else besides class, you'd be out and going to class, or not going to class, but going and doing that thing. It has to do with what's important rather than the actual weather. So these observations can kind of spur our creativity and our curiosity about the world, and help us to design something based on that. Now, we can also look at theories. So a source of an idea is some kind of theoretical approach. You learn about somebody's philosophy of life, kind of this theoretical basis for understanding the world. So we look at a pattern that's in human behavior. So how about this? Are people in the Midwest more likely to experience alien contact? That's interesting. We talk about things that are like parapsychological, like an alien observation or a UFO sighting. And we kind of have this stereotype maybe about who is a type of person who is likely to witness a UFO sighting. And we think about maybe sometimes a yokel who's kind of uneducated and is thinking, yeah, I saw the lights and everything. And we have this kind of image of that. Maybe it's stereotypical, but we have this image of it. But there's a theory that drives that. Why are people who are like that more likely to see a UFO? By the way, they aren't more likely to see a UFO. That's a stereotype based on some kind of theory that you might have about that. Another theory is that people use different language when they're mad. People, when you're in an academic setting, use a different type of language. When you're mad, it's a different type of language. When you're with your peers, it's another kind of language. So could be a theory behind that using a specific type of language, using words and syntax and inflections and things like that when you're mad or angry, create some kind of different understanding of the information that you're trying to convey. There's a lot of psycholinguistic theories behind that. So you could use a theory to describe why somebody is mad, to set up some kind of a study based on that. What role do early childhood experiences have in current behavior? Again, a lot of theories behind that, a lot of psychodynamic theories that drive that question. So when you're thinking about developing some kind of research, you can use a theory that's out there. You can wonder, oh geez, I wonder if biopsychology has any impact on the way that people express their gender. And you could go through a lot of understanding of biopsychology, and you could sort through some of the issues, and you could test some of the issues that go in there. Maybe it has to do with hormones. Maybe it has to do with physical anatomy. There's lots of different theories that you could base that on, even within psychobiology. So again, lots of theories can drive some kind of research questions. The idea is that you'll generate new theory as your endeavor when you're using current theory. So what you're going to do is you're going to expand a theory. So you're going to expand some kind of psycholinguistic theory that says that, we supported what's already out there, but what's interesting is that we found ... whatever your finding might be. So you can expand the current theory by adding on to it. Now, the last source for idea that we're going to cover is past research. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, it's already been done. We want to do something new. You'd be surprised at how often there is unanswered questions in past research. In particular, when you look at journal articles in the discussion section, there's almost always a section called Suggestions for Further Research. And what that is it's the authors saying that, well, there was a delimiter that we didn't include that would be interesting to look at. So this delimiter, or a selected aspect that they chose not to look at, and it's completely reasonable. We can't look at everything in a particular study. So they selected to not look at something. And after their research was conducted, they found their conclusions, and they wrote up that, geez, this thing that we didn't study could be interesting if you wanted to take our research and run with it. There are lots of research articles out there that say, here's what you can do with our research, or this is what we would suggest you would do now as a result of our research. It's a required part of doing research in many publications. You can also look at the limitations. Maybe there was a limitation by saying that, we only had 15 people respond to our survey, so we're not too sure that our results are valid. Now, obviously, you'd hope that you get more than 15 results in any particular survey, but it could be a limitation, and you could say to yourself, well, geez, I know that I could find at least 50 people right now who are interested in that same kind of topic who would do my survey. that means that you could take their study, do a replication, and get some results. And maybe you'd support their findings, maybe you wouldn't support their findings, but you'd be able to increase the amount of data that is in that particular line of research. So when you're thinking of doing past research, there are lots of ways that you can do that by looking at databases. We'll take a look at that in a moment and in class. But looking at past research is something that you can do using available databases that are free, either through Olivet College or even by using a Google Scholar search, which we'll cover a little bit later on in this lecture. But first, let's talk about the types of research reports that are available for you to look at. The three main types are literature reviews, theory articles, and empirical articles. And we'll look at these kind of in no particular order. I mean, they're presented in this order on the slide, but there is no rhyme or reason to why they're in that particular order. So let's take a look first at literature reviews. And literature reviews, you may have heard of these. They're used to summarize the current research. The idea of doing any kind of good research is to take a look at the body of research that's already out there, looking and seeing what's available for you to study, and trying to find some kind of gap in the research. Trying to find out something that the entire body of research hasn't yet covered. Sometimes that can be daunting because there's a lot of research out there. But you could find a gap in the research by studying some kind of different population, maybe using a different school if you're looking at college students, maybe looking at a different sport if you're looking at sports. Whatever it is, you could find the gap, but you must do that first by doing a literature review. And the literature review can be a standalone research report, but it's usually in the context of a larger project. By kind of satisfying this research into what's already out there so that you can frame your own research and not replicate too much. You can also identify a trend to find out what kind of things are being studied. There are lots of trends that come out. I remember being an undergrad, and every time I was looking at a particular article or a particular topic, lo and behold, there was something about Asperger's disorder, because that was kind of cutting edge. You know, we've kind of known about Asperger's for a while as part of being on the autism spectrum, but back in 2003, 2004, 2005, there was a lot of new research on it, and it was just everywhere. So you could see that trend. And what can also happen during a literature review is a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is when you have multiple studies that look at about the same kind of topic that have data that you can compare to one another. So if you have a particular line of research that's all looking at IQ scores for particular types of individuals, you could take all of these studies, look at their data, and compare them to one another. So if a study says that people who live in rural settings have higher IQs, and you compared that to a research study that says that people who live in urban settings have higher IQs, then you could compare those and you could find among many different kinds of studies and start to look at a broader picture of where people have higher IQs. And there are lots of different examples of how you could organize a meta-analysis. It can become very complex for sure, but the meta-analysis allows you to take lots of different research, put it together, and to make comparisons between all the research. Right now, the meta-analysis is a really booming idea in quantitative statistics because of the way that we're trying to incorporate something that's called effect size. And effect size is a measurement of the difference between what we would expect if there were no impact in a study and what we're actually observing. For example, if we're looking at an IQ test and we're looking at a study of IQs between men and women, if we expect that men and women are the same, then we would expect there to be no effect, meaning that the effect size would be, 0 or something. But if there was a big difference between men and women in IQ, then we would expect to see a large effect size. And you can compare effect sizes between many different studies because they're kind of all on the same scale, effect sizes. So the meta-analysis is becoming very popular as we move toward this idea of effect size. The theory article is a contribution to the theoretical perspective. So the research that will drive new theory can confirm or challenge the current theory. So as you're developing your research ideas, you might think of something like the humanistic perspective, which is a theoretical perspective, and you could incorporate something like a person-centered approach, which is something that's really popular in therapeutic settings, and you could talk about the impacts of the person-centered approach on working with college students in career counseling. And you could contribute to the theory based on that. Now, you might be actually addressing a practical concern, but if you're focusing on the theory, does focusing on the exact needs and desires of the student that you're working with lead to a better outcome? That can contribute to the theoretical perspective on person-centered therapy. Whereas sometimes students just want to be told what to do, which is not person-centered. And what you might find is that the person-centered approach does not support career counseling, that students want to do aptitude tests to find out what they're best at and to be given, a range of possible choices that would work for them. So the theory article is something that you might read or write that helps to confirm or not confirm a theory, or support or not support a theory. Now, when we're talking about kind of qualitative and quantitative methodology, we're really focusing on empirical articles. And empirical articles are good for using observations and numbers in order to develop an understanding of the research. Now, we'll talk about quantitative and qualitative research as we go through the course, but at some point, both of them will use some kind of numbers. Quantitative research obviously uses numbers because it's based on quantifying things like scales, inventories, developing an understanding of a phenomenon by measuring intensity or frequency or duration or something like that. And then qualitative research is usually dealt with by coding things. So if you want to listen to an interview and listen to the number of times that somebody talks about socioeconomic status, you can do that by coding phrases. So if you're talking about socioeconomic status, you're talking about where they are socially, so what kind of job they have. So maybe you could code something in terms of what kind of job it is, a lower class, middle class, upper class job, maybe a blue collar or white collar, something like that. Or you could qualitatively look at something in terms of how much money somebody makes or how much disposable income they have. So even when you're looking at a qualitative methodology, you can use numbers to quantify the type of statements that are being made or the number of a type of statements that are being made. So empirical articles can be used for both qualitative and quantitative methodologies. The empirical articles have several aspects to them. They have an abstract, an introduction and literature review, a methods section, a results section, discussion, and references section. It's important that we talk about the methods sections, the references section, because it's a valid part of the empirical article that supports all of your information. Now, we will talk about each of these as we go through the project, and there is a good breakdown summary of what these are in the chapter, but I do want to just kind of run through just briefly to talk about each section. So the abstract is a section that talks about your entire research project in a short paragraph, usually 250 to 500 words. The number of words in the abstract is kind of variable depending on who you ask. The APA has some ideas on it, and generally if you stay less than 500, you're in pretty good shape, which means that it has to be pretty succinct. But the abstract includes a summary of your introduction, so a brief statement about what you're researching, how you're researching it by summarizing the methods section, the results that you got as a result of conducting your study, the discussion of your results in terms of things like a plain language interpretation of your results, some statement about the limitations, or a statement about what you need to do for further research, and then a references section that has all of your references in it. The introduction and literature review will contain a background of your study, that all the information that supports your study usually includes things like the research questions and hypotheses, because it's also an introduction. And sometimes it will include an annotated bibliography if you're doing a particular project that does not require a full-blown introduction like the project that you'll do for this class. The methods section includes the participants, the procedures, and the instruments that you're using to conduct your research. It also sets up the statistical methods if you're using that. or the qualitative methods that you're using for coding and bracketing if you're doing a qualitative study. It also the project also has a results section, which is the results of either your statistical analysis or your qualitative analysis. So it's some kind of result, but not quite an interpretation of all the results. That in the interpretation will kind of be in your results section in terms of what the statistics mean, but the discussion section has the plain language discussion or narration of your results. That's put in more of a story format. And the discussion section again will also include it'll also include your limitations, your suggestions for further research. Then your references section is an APA formatted alphabetical list of all the references that you use to conduct your study. Now, in order to conduct research, we do like to explore the past research to help us support what we're doing. Even if you're doing something like a grounded theory where you're starting with nothing and working your way up, you still want to find out what else is out there in your topic so that you know where to start and where to take off from. So the journal is designed for researchers who wish to publish their findings. So the journal is kind of like the gold standard for publishing research. It's peer reviewed, meaning that it goes through a panel of individuals that are experts in research and in your field that will look at the article to make sure that it meets the standards for publishing. And there are hundreds of journals in the social science fields. Your book does a really good job of listing some of the most popular ones. And the journals can be found in databases. They can also be found in your library. But generally, it's going toward databases because it's easier to publish these things online than it is to in paper. Plus, it makes it more widely accessible. Speaking of online databases, the online databases is kind of like a library just for journals. So you can walk into the library at Olivet College, you'll see books and things like that. You can think of the library as a database for all that information. Well, a database for journals is something like PsycInfo, which is part of ProQuest. It can also be any number of databases that are related to the social sciences like ERIC or whatever. There are lots of them out there, and we'll take a look at some of them in class. You can also have access to these through the library and through, oh, that's right, and Blackboard is listed in there too. All of our Blackboard classes automatically have resources that are linked to the library. So you can use your Olivet College credentials to look through the databases. When you are looking for information using a reference, you'll need to be savvy about the parts of the reference in order to put it all together, because you'll need to actually develop a references section. But you can also use existing references like in a journal article or in the back of a book to find information. So the anatomy of a reference is listed here. This is a snip from the actual book. So it's in there for you to look at, and it does a really good job of including all the pertinent information of a journal article. One thing that I will point out is that it looks like they didn't update one aspect, the digital object identifier, the DOI. Instead of it saying DOI : anymore, in the 7th edition of the APA manual going forward, it'll say HTTPS ://doi.org/ and then the number. They'll all say that now because doi.org is what houses all the DOI numbers now. So instead of it just saying DOI : it'll be an actual web link. That way you can click on it if the hyperlink is active in an online journal article to get to it. Again, I think that you can look through the anatomy of the reference on your own. It's important to understand that that each of these aspects are very carefully formatted, meaning that when you see a space between the two initials, there should be a space between the two initials when you do it. If the volume number is italicized, your volume number should be italicized, but the issue number should not. By the way, the journal volume is just this whole box of what they listed here. The volume is the first number, the issue is the second number. So generally it's the 38th year and the 5th issue of that year. So the 5th time they published that year. Sometimes it can be by month, sometimes it's every 6 weeks or whatever it is. They're not always regular, so you can't just say it's the 5th month. It's the 5th issue of generally that year. and then the page number. So I encourage you to look through this to kind of put it all together and to recognize that there is a format for doing this, and it's standard in APA. Now, something that we can cover in class a little bit is how to use search terms in order to find information. Generally, you can use the same kind of search parameters that you use when you're doing a regular Google search by searching for keywords when you're doing search through a database. But it is important that you set up what are called Boolean operators. Boolean, I said Boolean like it's food. Boolean operators. Which are and, or, and not. So if you want to search for something like IQ score, I don't know why I'm on IQ scores, but if you're searching for IQ scores in the Midwest, you might search for IQ scores and Midwest, and it will bring up articles that have both of those search terms in it. But if I did not want to include something like Asperger's, again, I told you that Asperger's was something that was in all journal articles, it seemed like, when I was doing research as an undergrad, I could say IQ scores and the Midwest, not Asperger's. So it would include all articles that had Midwest and IQ in them, but not Asperger's. So there are lots of different ways that you can search using those Boolean operators, but you can also rely on certain parameters, like the type of publication, whether it's a book or a journal article or a newspaper, or how old the article is, because sometimes we want to rely on recent research to drive our research. So we want to use articles that are within 10 years. You can set that up as well. So there are lots of different ways to use these. I encourage you to open up any of the databases that you have access to and just search for something. First thing that pops into your head. If it's something like firework safety, then you could search for firework safety and see what comes up and limit it to the last few years or whatever. Lots of different ways to do that. Some interesting things that you can use that are free to you are internet searches and Google Scholar. Internet searches aren't great because you can get all kinds of information that is not necessarily scholarly, but using Google Scholar, you're more likely to find them. Again, things can slip into Google Scholar that aren't necessarily scholarly, but you can still kind of sort them out rather easily. So you want to search for full text whenever you can in order to get the full amount of information. What's nice about Google Scholar is that you can actually search for future research. Now, I know that sounds odd, right? I don't mean like time travel, but what I mean is that using Google Scholar, if you find a really cool article from 2004 that talks about something like animal-assisted therapy or pet therapy, you can find an article from 2004, and you can also do a search for the articles that article was cited in. So if you have an article from 2004, you can click a button that says cited by, and it will bring up a list of references that include the article you're looking at, which means that you're looking at articles that occurred after the one that you have found. So you can kind of creep forward to find who is using the research that you're interested in. So let's say that I want to do a search for food allergies among students. So I'm going to go to an article that I had found using Google Scholar. So I can click on this link here. And it'll load. Here it comes. So let me bring this over here. So if I have this article, and I know I'm just kind of showing you a snippet of the screen, but I have this article here, and I can scroll down, and I see all this cool information about it. Now, this is an article that I found using Google Scholar, but you'll notice that there's really no information about this article that says who it was cited by. Now, there is a citation index and things like that it uses to show how often people are citing this. So if I take this article, yeah, that's a bad way to copy and paste it. If I take this article, I'm going to control copy it. I'm going to paste it into my search bar, and I can. Oh, come on. Hear that again. I can see that my article shows up, and there's published in different places. But if I search for cited by 116, I can find all these articles that cited the one that I'm looking at. So some of them happened later on, like 2010, 2014. So what I can do is I can kind of go forward in my search for the research in order to find the more relevant and current articles that are using my same topic. So there are lots of different ways to go about that. Here's one all the way up in 2018, and probably I could find some in 2019, maybe even 2020. It might not be as easy in 2020 because things that were created in 2020 probably haven't been published yet. So there are lots of different ways to find information, and it's important that if you're going to try to broaden your search and you have an article that you really, really like, then you do that cited by search using Google Scholar, or by copying and pasting a journal article into a search bar. You can usually come up with some good information on that. So that is where we start when we're doing research. I hope this has been helpful to you to be able to kind of focus on what's important, and I look forward to seeing what you can do with your article responses based on what we've talked about here.